They called humans the weakest species in the galaxy. No claws, no venom, no natural armor. When the Great Hunt was announced across 7-star systems, every alien civilization laughed at Earth's single representative. After all, what could one fragile human accomplish against creatures that could melt steel with their breath or phase through solid matter? But they had never encountered something far more dangerous than any biological weapon. Human persistence, ingenuity, and the terrifying ability to turn any environment into a hunting ground. What started as cosmic entertainment was about to become a lesson in why you should never underestimate the species that crawled its way to the top of Earth's food chain armed with nothing but determination and a big brain. Marcus Chun stood in the massive crystalline arena, watching alien dignitaries place their bets through the transparent walls. The Galactic Hunt Authority had built this coliseum on a dead moon, specifically designed to broadcast the greatest spectacle in known space to billions of viewers across 7-star systems. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was probably the only participant nobody had bothered to bet on. The arena itself was a marvel of engineering, a perfect sphere 3 kilometers in diameter, capable of generating any environment imaginable. Desert wastelands, Arctic tundras, dense jungles, underwater caverns, even zero-gravity asteroid fields could be created at will. For the next 7 days, this would be home to the most dangerous game ever conceived. Ladies, gentlemen, and distinguished beings of all classifications, the announcer's voice boomed through universal translators. Welcome to the 847th Galactic Hunt Championship. The crowd erupted in a cacophony of roars, clicks, hisses, and sounds Marcus couldn't even classify. In the VIP section, he spotted the betting favorites. The Zarathi delegation was practically vibrating with excitement around their champion, a 12-foot-tall insectoid nightmare named Caxtel, whose razor-sharp mandibles could slice through titanium. The creature's 4 arms each ended in different specialized weapons: plasma claws, acid sprayers, neural disruptors, and something that looked like it could tear holes in space itself. Next to them sat the Voltarian representatives, their crystalline bodies refracting the arena's lights into brilliant rainbows. Their hunter, Zephyra, appeared to be made of living diamond, capable of hardening her form to withstand small nuclear explosions or softening it to slip through gaps barely wider than a human finger. She could also manipulate gravitational fields, making her effectively able to fly and crush opponents with localized gravity wells. The Threnodai section was notably quieter, their shadow-wreathed forms barely visible even under the bright lights. Their champion, something called the Void Whisper, existed partially outside normal space-time. It could phase in and out of reality, strike from impossible angles, and its very presence drained the life force from nearby organic matter. The few times Marcus had glimpsed it during the preliminary ceremonies, he'd felt an inexplicable chill run down his spine. The Corvin Empire had sent Bloodfang, a predator that had evolved on a world where everything was trying to kill everything else. Standing 8 feet tall, with midnight black fur, enhanced reflexes that bordered on precognitive, and claws that secreted a paralytic toxin, Bloodfang had literally been engineered by millions of years of evolution to be the perfect killer. Its species had no natural predators because they had systematically hunted everything else to extinction on their homeworld. The Sindari Collective's entry was perhaps the most terrifying of all. The Swarm Mind appeared as a constantly shifting mass of insectoid drones, each no larger than Marcus's thumb, but collectively possessing the intelligence of a supercomputer and the destructive capability of a small army. They could separate to attack from multiple directions, reform into specialized configurations for different tactical situations, and adapt their strategy in real time based on collective learning. Then there were the others, the Glacians with their ice manipulation abilities and sub-zero biology that could freeze opponents solid, the Parathi fire dancers who could generate plasma hot enough to melt stone, the Quantari probability manipulators who could literally make unlucky things happen to their enemies, and the Nebular Collective's gas form representative that could become intangible at will and suffocate opponents by displacing all the oxygen in an area. And finally, there's Marcus. 5 feet 10 inches of what the galaxy considered the most pathetic excuse for a sentient species ever discovered. No claws, no armor, no energy manipulation abilities, no size advantage, no venom, no built-in weapons of any kind. Just a standard issue environmental suit, a basic toolkit, and whatever he could scavenge from the arena during the competition. The betting odds displayed on screens throughout the Coliseum told the whole story. Caxtel was favored at 2-1, followed by Zephyr at 3-1, then the Void Whisper at 5-1. Marcus appeared at the very bottom of the list at 847-1, the longest odds in the history of the competition. Several betting houses had refused to take wagers on him at all, claiming it would be taking money under false pretenses. This year's hunt will take place across 5 distinct environmental zones, the announcer continued, each more challenging than the last. Participants will face not only each other, but also the indigenous dangers of each environment. The last being standing wins glory for their species and the right to represent their civilization on the Galactic Council for the next 50 years. Marcus had never asked to be Earth's representative. The selection had been made by bureaucrats back home who figured it didn't matter who they sent since humanity had no chance of winning anyway. They'd essentially treated it as a free vacation for someone willing to put on a show for the cameras before inevitably being eliminated. What they didn't know, and what none of the betting aliens realized, was that Marcus Chun wasn't just any human. He was a former Special Forces operator, survival expert, and persistence hunter who had spent years studying every available piece of information about previous galactic hunts. While other species focused on their natural advantages, Marcus had done something uniquely human. He had studied his enemies. The Zarathi were incredibly dangerous in direct combat, but their exoskeletons were vulnerable to temperature extremes. The Voltarians were nearly invincible when fully crystallized, but the energy required to maintain that state was enormous, and they needed regular rest periods. The Threnodidae could phase through matter, but doing so required them to become partially incorporeal, making them vulnerable to energy-based attacks during the transition. Every species had weaknesses. Every hunter had blind spots, and Marcus had spent months learning them all. Contestants, prepare for initial deployment, came the announcement. Environmental Zone 1 will be a temperate forest ecosystem with moderate precipitation and standard atmospheric composition. Deployment in 30 seconds. Marcus checked his equipment one final time. A simple survival knife, a basic multi-tool, some rations, water purification tablets, and an emergency medical kit. Compared to the natural weapons and abilities of his opponents, it seemed pitifully inadequate. But he had something none of them possessed: 200,000 years of human evolutionary adaptation for persistence hunting and problem-solving. The arena shimmered, and suddenly, Marcus found himself standing in a dense forest. Towering trees stretched hundreds of feet overhead, their canopies so thick that only scattered beams of sunlight reached the forest floor. The air was thick with humidity and the sounds of unfamiliar creatures moving through the undergrowth. Around him, he could hear the other contestants being deployed. Somewhere in the distance, trees were crashing down as Caxtel carved through the forest with his plasma claws. The temperature dropped noticeably in one direction, indicating the Galatian representative was already establishing territory. A section of forest several hundred meters away simply vanished into shadow, marking the Void Whisper's arrival. Marcus didn't run toward the sounds of destruction like several of the other hunters. Instead, he did something that would have seemed cowardly to most species, but was actually deeply strategic. He disappeared. Moving with practiced stealth, Marcus began what humans had been doing since before they invented fire. He started tracking his prey. But unlike his ancestors who hunted mammoth and saber-toothed cats, Marcus was hunting beings who could tear holes in reality and manipulate the fundamental forces of physics. The forest around him was alive with the sounds of the hunt beginning. Somewhere, powerful beings were clashing in displays of force that shook the ground. But Marcus was playing a different game entirely. He found his first clue within an hour. Massive gouges in tree trunks, still smoking from plasma burns. Caxtel had passed this way, moving in a straight line toward what sounded like combat deeper in the forest. But, more importantly, Marcus could see something the Zarathi champion had missed in his haste. Scattered around the base of the damaged trees were tiny metal fragments, each no bigger than a grain of rice. The swarm mind had been here too, probably scouting ahead of the main group. The fragments were shed components, replaced as the collective adapted to the forest environment. Marcus carefully collected several of the fragments and examined them under a small magnifying lens. Each piece was incredibly sophisticated, containing computational elements that probably exceeded Earth's best supercomputers. But they were also completely dependent on quantum entanglement communication with the main collective. That gave him an idea. Moving carefully through the forest, Marcus began to track the swarm mind's movement pattern. The collective was smart, adaptive, and dangerous, but it was also predictable in some ways. It favored efficient paths, always seeking the most advantageous positions with maximum sensory coverage and minimal energy expenditure. The sound of combat grew louder as Marcus worked. Somewhere ahead, at least two of the hunters were engaged in battle. The ground shook with explosive impacts, and strange lights flickered through the trees. The alien equivalent of adrenaline was pumping through every participant except Marcus, who remained focused on his methodical approach. As night began to fall, Marcus had mapped the movement patterns of 4 different hunters without being detected by any of them. The Zarathi was aggressive and direct, favoring overwhelming force. The Glacian moved in expanding circles, freezing everything in her territory to create defensive positions. The Swarm Mind was conducting systematic reconnaissance, gathering data before making any major moves. And somewhere in the growing darkness, the Void Whisperer was stalking all of them. Marcus made camp in a carefully chosen location, a small cave system he discovered beneath the roots of one of the massive trees. The entrance was concealed, and the cave itself had multiple exit routes. More importantly, it was positioned at a convergence point where 3 different hunter territories were beginning to overlap. As he settled in for the night, Marcus allowed himself a small smile. The other hunters were playing by the rules of their own evolution. Be bigger, stronger, faster, more deadly than the competition. But humans had learned something different during their rise to dominance on Earth. Sometimes the best hunter isn't the one with the biggest claws or the strongest armor. Sometimes it's the one who thinks 3 moves ahead and understands that in any ecosystem, the most dangerous predator isn't always the most obvious one. Above ground, the sounds of the hunt continued. But in his hidden cave, Marcus Chun was doing something that would have been incomprehensible to most alien species. He was planning. Not just for tomorrow, but for every day of the competition. While his opponents focused on immediate threats and direct confrontation, Marcus was preparing for a campaign. The galaxy had written off humanity as weak and irrelevant. Tomorrow, Marcus would begin teaching them why that had been a mistake. The hunt had officially begun, but unknown to his competitors, they weren't the only ones hunting. They were also being hunted. Marcus woke before dawn to the sound of something massive moving through the forest above his hidden cave. Through the small gaps in the root system that concealed his entrance, he could see the distinctive blue glow that indicated the Voltarian hunter was nearby. Zephyra was moving in her semi-crystallized form, harder than steel, but still mobile, searching for threats in the pre-dawn darkness. He remained perfectly still as she passed overhead, her crystalline feet creating small tremors with each step. Once she was gone, Marcus carefully emerged from his hiding place and began the second day of what was turning into a very different kind of hunt than anyone expected. The previous night's combat had ended with the elimination of one contestant. The Parathi fire dancer had been found frozen solid in a glacier that definitely hadn't been there when the arena was first generated. The Glacian, whose species name roughly translated to Winter's Embrace, had claimed her first victory. The arena's automated systems had quickly teleported the frozen corpse away, leaving behind only a field of unnaturally blue ice as a warning to the other hunters. Marcus spent the early morning hours doing something that would have seemed suicidal to most observers. He deliberately entered territory that had been marked by multiple predators. But he wasn't being reckless. Every movement was calculated based on intelligence he'd gathered about hunter behavior patterns and territorial boundaries. His first stop was a grove of trees that bore the characteristic acid burns of Caxtel's Passage. The Zarathi had been hunting aggressively, seeking direct confrontation with anything that moved. Marcus wasn't interested in the obvious signs of destruction. Instead, he focused on what the alien warrior had left behind: mold fragments. Zarathi grew by shedding their exoskeletons periodically, and combat stress accelerated the process. Marcus found several small pieces of shed chitin, each one containing pheromone markers that would be invisible to human senses, but critically important to other Zarathi. With careful chemical analysis using his basic field kit, Marcus was able to isolate and concentrate these markers. His plan was audacious and relied on something most alien species didn't understand about humans: their capacity for long-term strategic thinking combined with tactical improvisation. Moving deeper into contested territory, Marcus began leaving false trails. Not the obvious kind that most species would recognize, but subtle environmental changes that would trigger specific behavioral responses in his targets. A small pile of rocks arranged in a pattern that would unconsciously direct the swarm mind toward a particular path. Scratches on tree bark that mimic territorial markings, designed to make the Void Whisperer believe another shadow predator was operating in the area. But his masterpiece was the trap he set for Caxtel. Marcus had studied recordings of previous galactic hunts and noticed something crucial about Zarathi psychology. They were honor-bound to respond to direct challenges, especially ones that implied their hunting prowess was being questioned. It was a cultural blind spot that had cost them victories in past competitions, but previous human researchers had dismissed it as irrelevant since humanity had never participated before. Using the concentrated pheromones from the molt fragments, Marcus created what appeared to be territorial markings from an unknown Zarathi. The chemical signature suggested a hunter of enormous size and aggressive temperament, one who was actively challenging Caxtel's dominance. He placed these false markers along a carefully chosen path that led to a natural bottleneck in the forest terrain. The location was perfect, a narrow canyon between two massive rock formations, with limited visibility and multiple vertical surfaces that would interfere with the Zarathi's plasma weapons. More importantly, it was directly adjacent to territory that the swarm mind had been systematically mapping. If everything went according to plan, Marcus would soon have his two most dangerous opponents fighting each other instead of hunting him. While he worked, Marcus became aware that he was being observed. Nothing obvious, just a subtle sense of being watched that his enhanced survival training had taught him to recognize. But instead of fleeing or confronting the observer, he did something unexpected. He began performing for them. Without acknowledging that he knew he was being watched, Marcus started setting up what appeared to be a basic human hunting camp. He gathered useful plants, began constructing simple tools from forest materials, and generally behaved exactly as alien intelligence profiles suggested humans would, like a primitive scavenger trying to survive through basic resourcefulness. What his observer couldn't see were the subtle preparations Marcus was making beneath the obvious activities. Every tool he crafted had multiple purposes. The simple shelter he was building was actually a sophisticated trap system. The plants he was gathering included several species that could be processed into compounds useful for chemical warfare. The observer, as Marcus had suspected, was one of the swarm mine scout drones. The artificial insect watched him for nearly 2 hours, recording his activities and transmitting data back to the collective. Marcus made sure to give them exactly what they expected to see: a weak human engaged in pathetic survival activities that posed no threat to superior alien hunters. When the drone finally departed, Marcus allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Phase 1 of his plan was complete. He had successfully convinced his most analytically dangerous opponent that he was irrelevant. The sound of combat erupted from the canyon an hour later. Marcus had positioned himself on a ridge overlooking the bottleneck, using natural camouflage to remain invisible while watching his plan unfold. Caxtel had discovered the false territorial markers and, exactly as predicted, had followed the trail with the aggressive confidence of a dominant predator responding to a challenge. The Zarathi warrior was magnificent in his fury, plasma claws extended and mandibles spread wide as he searched for the impudent rival who dared mark territory in his hunting ground. His four arms moved in complex patterns, scanning for threats while his enhanced senses analyzed every chemical trace in the area. He was so focused on finding his supposed Zarathi challenger that he missed the nearly invisible approach of the swarm mind until it was too late. The collective had been conducting systematic reconnaissance of the canyon when their drones detected the massive Zarathi presence. Unlike Marcus, they had no reason to avoid confrontation. Their analysis indicated a 73% probability of successful elimination if they attacked while the target was distracted and confined in the narrow space. The attack began with surgical precision. Dozens of drones swarmed Caxtel from multiple angles, their tiny energy weapons designed to exploit gaps in his exoskeleton. But the Zarathi were not easily prey, even when caught off guard. Caxtel's combat response was immediate and devastating. His plasma claws carved through the air in complex patterns, creating intersecting energy fields that vaporized entire swarms of drones. His acid sprayers filled the canyon with corrosive clouds that dissolved anything they touched. The neural disruptors sent chaotic electromagnetic pulses that disrupted the quantum entanglement communications linking the collective's components. But the swarm mind was designed for exactly this kind of combat. As fast as drones were destroyed, others adapted to the new threat parameters. The collective began forming specialized configurations. Some drones created energy shields to protect others. Some formed larger constructs with enhanced weapons. Others began tunneling through the rock walls to attack from unexpected angles. The battle raged for 20 minutes, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. Caxtel was too experienced and too well-armed to be easily overwhelmed, but the swarm mind was too adaptable and numerous to be completely eliminated. And then Marcus introduced the third factor. From his concealed position, he activated a small device he'd constructed using components salvaged from the shed swarm mind fragments. It wasn't sophisticated by galactic standards, but it didn't need to be. All it had to do was broadcast a specific quantum frequency that would interfere with the collective's coordination protocols. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The swarm mind's perfect coordination dissolved into chaos as individual drones lost contact with the central intelligence. Some continued attacking Caxtel, others began attacking each other, and many simply fell out of the sky as their navigation systems failed. Caxtel, sensing weakness, pressed his advantage. His plasma claws reached full intensity as he carved through the now disorganized drones with methodical efficiency. Within minutes, the canyon floor was littered with tiny mechanical corpses, and the swarm mind was reduced to less than 30% of its original mass. But the collective was not finished. In a desperate final gambit, the remaining drones formed a single large configuration and began to retreat, broadcasting emergency signals that would attract other hunters to the area. They had learned enough about Caxtel's capabilities to upgrade their threat assessment, and now they were calling for backup. Marcus smiled as he watched the surviving drones flee. Phase 2 was complete. The swarm mind was crippled, Caxtel was exhausted from intense combat, and both now considered each other primary threats. More importantly, the emergency signals would soon draw other hunters to investigate, creating exactly the kind of multi-party chaos that would allow Marcus to continue operating undetected. As he prepared to leave his observation post, Marcus caught sight of something that made him freeze. In the shadows at the far end of the canyon, reality seemed to shimmer and bend. The Void Whisperer had been watching the battle too, and, unlike Marcus, it had been detected. Caxtel's head snapped around as his enhanced senses registered the dimensional distortion. His mandibles clicked with aggressive anticipation as he faced this new threat. The Zarathi warrior was wounded from his battle with the Swarm Mind, but he was far from defeated. The Void Whisper materialized just enough to communicate, its form a vague, humanoid outline filled with writhing darkness. When it spoke, reality itself seemed to echo with its words. Impressive, Zarathi, but you hunt in dimensions you do not understand. Caxtel's response was predictably direct, a focused plasma beam aimed at the creature's center mass. The beam passed harmlessly through the Void Whisperer's partially phased form, but the alien was ready for this. As the energy attack dissipated, the shadow being began to solidify, its form becoming more defined and more dangerous. What followed was unlike anything Marcus had ever seen. The Void Whisperer existed partially outside normal space-time, allowing it to attack from angles that shouldn't have been possible. It struck at Caxtel from above, below, and through dimensions that human physics couldn't adequately describe. But the Zarathi warrior was adapting, using his multiple arms to defend against attacks from multiple dimensional vectors simultaneously. The battle was devastating to the local environment. Trees withered and died when caught in the Void Whisperer's dimensional wake. Rock faces melted under Caxtel's increasingly desperate plasma attacks. The very air seemed to crack and fracture as two fundamentally different forms of physics-defying abilities clashed. Marcus used the chaos to extract himself from the area, but not before planting one final strategic element. Using materials he'd prepared earlier, he created what appeared to be evidence of a human camp that had been hastily abandoned when the fighting started. A few personal items, some basic tools, and, most importantly, a clear trail leading away from the canyon toward the deeper forest. Any hunter who investigated would conclude that the primitive human had fled in terror when real predators began fighting. It would reinforce their assumption that he was weak, cowardly, and unworthy of serious attention. More importantly, it would lead them away from his actual position and toward a section of forest where he'd identified several natural hazards that could be turned to his advantage. As night fell on the second day, Marcus counted his victories. The Parathi were eliminated. The Swarm Mind was crippled and would need time to rebuild. Caxtel and the Void Whisperer were locked in a devastating battle that would leave the survivor weakened. The remaining hunters were beginning to turn their attention toward each other instead of the supposedly harmless human. But Marcus knew the real test was just beginning. The arena's environmental systems would soon activate the next phase of the competition, introducing new challenges and forcing the surviving hunters into closer proximity. The forest stage had been about elimination and misdirection. The next stage would be about proving that sometimes the most dangerous predator is the one nobody sees coming until it's too late. Hidden in his new camp, deep in territory that every other hunter believed was empty, Marcus began preparing for the escalation he knew was coming. Tomorrow would bring new environments, new dangers, and new opportunities. But tonight, while his opponents nursed their wounds and planned their next moves, the supposedly weakest hunter in galactic history was doing what humans had always done best, turning disadvantages into weapons and proving that intelligence, patience, and strategic thinking could defeat any amount of raw power. The galaxy still didn't understand what they were dealing with, but they were about to learn why humanity had never needed claws, armor, or energy manipulation to become the apex predator on their homeworld. Sometimes all you needed was the ability to think 3 moves ahead and the patience to wait for the perfect moment to strike. The arena shuddered as massive environmental generators came online, and Marcus felt the familiar sensation of reality being rewritten around him. The forest dissolved like a mirage, replaced by something that made his enhanced survival instincts scream warnings. Where peaceful woodland had existed moments before, now stretched in vast Arctic wasteland under an alien sky, filled with two moons and strange aurora patterns. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in seconds, and Marcus immediately activated the thermal regulation systems in his environmental suit. Around him, he could hear the other hunters adapting to the new environment in their own ways. Somewhere to the north, the air temperature was dropping even further as winter's embrace claimed her natural advantage. The Glacian had just become the most dangerous hunter in the arena. But Marcus had expected this. The arena's environmental shifts followed a predictable pattern based on balancing advantages between different hunter types. After the forest stage favored stealth and tactics, the Arctic stage would favor those adapted to extreme cold and environmental manipulation. The third stage would likely be desert or volcanic, favoring heat-adapted species. Each environment was designed to give different hunters their moment to dominate. What the arena designers hadn't counted on was a species that had learned to thrive in every environment their planet could produce. Marcus activated a device he'd constructed during the previous night using salvage components and materials gathered from the forest. It wasn't sophisticated by galactic standards, but it was perfectly suited for what he needed: a localized environmental scanner that could map temperature gradients, atmospheric composition, and electromagnetic field variations across the Arctic landscape. The data it provided was immediately useful. Winter's embrace was located approximately 2 kilometers to the northwest, in an area where the ambient temperature had dropped to nearly absolute zero. She was actively expanding her territory, creating a zone of permanent winter that would be lethal to most organic life forms. But more importantly, her activities were having exactly the kind of environmental impact that Marcus had hoped for. The Glacian's extreme cold manipulation was creating massive atmospheric pressure differentials. Warm air from other parts of the arena was being drawn toward her territory, creating powerful wind currents that carried scent molecules across vast distances. To most hunters, this would be a complication. To Marcus, it was a detailed intelligence network. Using a technique developed by human Arctic researchers, Marcus began reading the wind patterns like a map. Each current carried chemical signatures that told him exactly where his opponents were located, what they were doing, and, most importantly, how they were adapting to the new environment. Caxtel had survived his battle with the Void Whisper, but barely. The chemical traces in the wind indicated significant damage to his exoskeleton and a metabolic stress pattern that suggested he was operating at reduced efficiency. The Zarathi were adapted for temperate climates, and the Arctic environment was pushing his biology beyond its optimal parameters. The Void Whisper had also survived, but its dimensional manipulation abilities were being affected by something Marcus found fascinating. The extreme cold was creating areas of space-time instability that interfered with the creature's phasing abilities. It was still dangerous, but it was now forced to remain corporeal for longer periods, making it vulnerable to conventional attacks. The Quantari probability manipulator was struggling the most. Marcus could detect the characteristic energy signatures of multiple failed probability cascades, indicating that the aliens' luck manipulation abilities were being disrupted by the chaotic environmental conditions. Random chance was hard to control when the environment itself was in constant flux. But the most interesting signature belonged to the Nebular Collective's representative. The gasform hunter was actually thriving in the new environment, using the complex atmospheric currents to spread itself across a much larger area than should have been possible. It was becoming effectively omnipresent, a vast network of conscious gas that could strike from anywhere within its expanded territory. Marcus filed this information away as he began implementing Phase 3 of his overall strategy. The previous stages had been about misdirection and elimination through proxy combat. This stage would be about turning the environment itself into a weapon. His first target was Bloodfang, the Corvin predator. The creature had adapted to the cold by entering a state of semi-hibernation that reduced its energy requirements while maintaining its deadly reflexes. It had found shelter in an ice cave system and was waiting for prey to come to it, relying on its enhanced senses to detect approaching threats. What Bloodfang didn't know was that Marcus had spent the previous hour mapping the cave system using sonic resonance techniques developed by human spelunkers. The caves were part of a complex network that had been formed by underground thermal vents. More importantly, those vents were still active, creating pockets of superheated steam that could be redirected with the right kind of structural modifications. Marcus began his work with characteristic human patience. While other species would have attempted a direct assault or elaborate trap system, he employed something far more subtle: civil engineering. Using his multi-tool and salvaged materials, Marcus began making tiny modifications to the cave system's natural drainage patterns. A small stone repositioned here, a minor scratch in the rock surface there, each change too small to be noticed, but collectively redirecting the flow of underground thermal currents. It took 6 hours of careful work, but eventually Marcus had created exactly what he needed: a system that would gradually increase the temperature in Bloodfang's resting area, while simultaneously flooding the cave with gases that would be harmless to most species, but would trigger severe allergic reactions in Corvin physiology. The beauty of the trap was its subtlety. To any observer, it would appear that Bloodfang had simply been unfortunate enough to choose a resting spot that turned out to be geologically unstable. The Corvin's death would seem like a natural hazard rather than a deliberate attack, maintaining Marcus's carefully cultivated image as a non-threat. But while Marcus worked on his long-term trap, immediate threats were developing elsewhere in the arena. The Swarm Mind had used the environmental transition to rebuild its numbers by cannibalizing materials from the arena's infrastructure. The collective now consisted of nearly 1,000 drones, each one upgraded with Arctic-specific modifications that allowed them to operate efficiently in sub-zero temperatures. They had also learned from their previous encounter with Caxtel, and were now employing more sophisticated tactical algorithms. Winter's Embrace had claimed the entire northern quadrant of the arena as her territory, creating a zone of absolute winter that was expanding southward at a steady rate. Any hunter caught in her territory would face temperatures below the survival threshold of most known biology, along with ice storms that could strip flesh from bone and magnetic field distortions that interfered with most forms of technology. The Voltarian Zephyra had adapted to the cold by shifting to her fully crystallized form, becoming essentially a living diamond sculpture that was immune to temperature extremes. But maintaining that level of crystallization required enormous energy reserves, and she was being forced to remain in one location to conserve power while still being able to defend herself if attacked. Most dangerous of all, the Nebular Collective's representative had begun actively hunting. The gas form entity was using the complex atmospheric currents to create localized weather phenomena, generating fog banks and ice storms that concealed its movements while it stalked its prey. It had already attempted attacks on both Caxtel and the Quantari, probing their defenses and learning their weaknesses. Marcus monitored these developments while completing his work on the Bloodfang trap. The arena was entering a new phase of activity, with multiple hunters beginning to move aggressively as the environmental conditions forced them out of passive survival mode and into active competition. It was time for Phase 4 of his plan. Moving across the Arctic landscape with surprising efficiency, Marcus began implementing a strategy that would have been impossible for any other species: environmental warfare on a massive scale. Humans had learned something during their evolution that most alien species never needed to discover. When you're not the biggest, strongest, or most deadly creature in your environment, you learn to make the environment work for you instead of against you. Marcus began by identifying the key stress points in the arena's environmental control systems. Every artificial ecosystem had vulnerabilities, points where small changes could cascade into major environmental effects. The arena's designers had built-in safety protocols to prevent catastrophic failures, but they had designed those protocols around the assumption that participants would be trying to survive the environment, not actively manipulate it. Using techniques developed by human climatologists and environmental engineers, Marcus began making carefully calculated modifications to atmospheric currents, thermal flows, and electromagnetic field patterns. Each change was tiny in isolation, but collectively they were rewriting the rules of the entire Arctic ecosystem. His first success came when Bloodfang's cave system finally reached critical thermal pressure. The Corvin predator awakened to find his shelter filling with superheated steam and gases that triggered immediate respiratory distress. In his weakened state from environmental adaptation stress, Bloodfang was unable to escape the cave before the allergic reaction reached fatal levels. To any observer, it appeared that the powerful hunter had simply succumbed to a combination of environmental stress and bad luck. The arena's automated systems recorded the death as environmental elimination, adding no points to any other hunter's score. But Marcus wasn't finished. His environmental modifications were just beginning to have their intended effects. The atmospheric pressure changes he'd initiated were beginning to disrupt Winter's Embrace's territory expansion. Her precisely controlled ice storms were becoming chaotic and unpredictable as the air currents she relied on shifted into new patterns. For the first time since the Arctic stage began, the Glacian was being forced to defend rather than expand her domain. The Swarm Mine's tactical algorithms were struggling to adapt to environmental conditions that changed faster than their learning protocols could compensate for. The Collective's drones were designed to analyze and adapt to static environments, not ecosystems in constant flux. Most importantly, the chaotic atmospheric conditions were masking Marcus's activities from the other hunters' sensors. To them, he appeared to be just another piece of environmental data lost in the growing storm of electromagnetic interference and thermal disturbance that was engulfing the arena. As the third day of competition ended, Marcus had eliminated 2 hunters without engaging in direct combat, crippled a third, and forced the others into defensive positions. More importantly, he had gained complete control over the arena's environmental systems in a way that none of them understood. The galaxy had assumed that environmental control was simply a matter of surviving natural hazards. They had never encountered a species that understood environment as a tool to be wielded rather than an obstacle to be endured. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as the arena shifted to its next environmental phase. But Marcus was ready. While his opponents focused on adapting to their surroundings, he had learned something far more dangerous: how to make his surroundings adapt to him. The hunt was entering its final phases, and the supposedly weakest participant was about to demonstrate why intelligent tool use had always been humanity's greatest evolutionary advantage. In a competition designed around natural weapons and innate abilities, Marcus was proving that the most dangerous weapon of all was a mind that could turn anything into a tool and any environment into a hunting ground. The galaxy was about to learn why humans had never needed evolution to give them claws or armor or energy manipulation abilities. They had something far more dangerous: the ability to look at any environment and figure out how to make it kill their enemies for them. The fourth environmental transition hit like a physical blow. The Arctic wasteland vanished in a shimmer of energy, replaced by something that made even Marcus's enhanced survival training sound alarm bells in his mind. The arena had become an active volcanic landscape, complete with rivers of molten lava, geysers of superheated gas, and an atmosphere thick with ash and toxic fumes. But this time Marcus was ready. While the other hunters scrambled to adapt to the new environment, Marcus activated systems he'd spent the previous night constructing. Hidden beneath his apparently primitive shelter, he had built a sophisticated environmental control network using components salvaged from eliminated contestants and materials scavenged from the arena's infrastructure. The network came online smoothly, immediately providing him with detailed environmental data: atmospheric composition, seismic activity patterns, lava flow directions, gas vent locations, and, most importantly, the stress indicators of the arena's containment systems. The volcanic environment wasn't just decoration. It was an active geological system that could be manipulated by anyone who understood the underlying physics. Marcus smiled grimly as he watched his opponents struggle with the new challenges. The volcanic stage was designed to favor heat-adapted species, but It also provided him with access to energy sources and environmental weapons that hadn't been available in the previous stages. The Nebular Collective's representative was the first to demonstrate the new environmental dynamics. The gas-form entity attempted to expand its consciousness into the volcanic atmosphere, but the complex chemistry of volcanic gases proved incompatible with its physiology. Instead of gaining omnipresence, the creature found itself being slowly poisoned by sulfur compounds and other toxic elements in the air. Winter's Embrace faced even greater challenges. Her ice manipulation abilities were almost useless in an environment where ambient temperatures regularly exceeded the melting point of most metals. She was forced to retreat to the few areas where underground water sources created temporary cool zones, severely limiting her mobility and tactical options. The Voltarian Zephyra discovered that extreme heat was as challenging as extreme cold for her crystalline physiology. Maintaining diamond hardness in temperatures that could melt stone required even more energy than surviving Arctic conditions. She was forced to choose between mobility and defense, unable to maintain both simultaneously. But the most interesting development involved the Quantari probability manipulator. The chaotic nature of volcanic activity was actually enhancing its abilities, providing a rich source of random events that could be influenced and redirected. For the first time in the competition, the alien was operating at something approaching full power. Marcus monitored these developments while implementing the next phase of his plan. 3 days of careful preparation had positioned him exactly where he needed to be for the final stages of the competition. It was time to stop being the hunted and start being the hunter. His first target was the crippled Swarm Mind Collective. The artificial intelligence had managed to rebuild some of its numbers, but the new drones were inferior constructs hastily assembled from substandard materials. More importantly, the collective's distributed consciousness was struggling to maintain coherence in an environment filled with electromagnetic interference from volcanic activity. Marcus began his attack not with weapons, but with information warfare. Using techniques developed by human computer scientists, he began broadcasting carefully crafted electromagnetic signals that mimicked the Swarm Mind's own communication protocols. But instead of useful data, Marcus was feeding the collective false information about environmental hazards, hunter locations, and tactical opportunities. The effect was subtle but devastating. Individual drones began making decisions based on corrupted data, leading them into dangerous areas or causing them to attack phantom threats. The collective's tactical algorithms, designed around perfect information sharing, couldn't compensate for systematic data corruption at the source level. Within an hour, the Swarm Mind had lost another 30% of its drones to environmental hazards that Marcus had convinced them were safe routes or tactical advantages. But more importantly, the collective was beginning to lose confidence in its own decision-making processes, entering a state of analysis paralysis that made it increasingly vulnerable to direct attack. But Marcus wasn't ready for direct confrontation yet. He had bigger targets in mind. The Zarathi warrior Caxtel had found refuge in a series of lava tubes that provided protection from the worst of the volcanic environment. But the same geological features that offered safety also created tactical limitations. The tubes had limited entrances and exits, making them potential death traps for anyone caught inside during increased volcanic activity. Marcus began making careful modifications to the local geological stability. Using shaped charges created from volcanic minerals and techniques developed by human demolitions experts, Marcus initiated a controlled series of microseismic events that would gradually destabilize the lava tube system. But instead of causing immediate collapse, his modifications would create a delayed cascade failure that would trigger only when seismic activity reached specific thresholds. All he needed was a way to increase local seismic activity at exactly the right moment. The solution came from an unexpected source, the Quantari probability manipulator. Marcus had been studying the aliens' behavior patterns and had identified something crucial about how probability manipulation actually worked. The creature wasn't violating physics. It was identifying and exploiting quantum uncertainty states to influence macro-scale events. But quantum effects were incredibly sensitive to environmental conditions, and Marcus had just gained access to an environment where he could control those conditions. Using his environmental network, Marcus began generating specific electromagnetic field patterns in areas where the Quantari was operating. The fields were designed to create quantum decoherence events that would interfere with the aliens' probability calculations without being obvious enough to trigger defensive responses. The result was exactly what Marcus had hoped for. The Quantari's attempts at luck manipulation began producing increasingly unpredictable results. An attempt to cause a small rockfall became a massive avalanche. An effort to create favorable wind currents triggered a localized tornado. Most importantly, an attempt to generate minor seismic activity for tactical advantage created exactly the kind of geological instability that Marcus needed to trigger his trap for Caxtel. The lava tube system collapsed in a spectacular display of geological violence, burying the Zarathi warrior under tons of molten rock. Caxtel's superior strength and plasma weapons were useless against the sheer mass of liquid stone that entombed him. His death appeared to be the result of the Quantari's probability manipulation gone wrong, further concealing Marcus's role in the elimination. But the galaxy's most experienced probability manipulator wasn't finished causing chaos. In a desperate attempt to regain control over increasingly unstable quantum effects, the Quantari began pushing its abilities to dangerous extremes, trying to force favorable probability outcomes through raw power rather than subtle influence. The result was a probability cascade that affected every remaining hunter simultaneously. Winter's Embrace found herself trapped in a rapidly forming ice cave as underground water sources suddenly shifted direction. The Voltarian's energy reserves catastrophically depleted as quantum fluctuations interfered with her crystallization matrix. The Nebular Collective's gaseous form began condensing involuntarily as atmospheric pressure changes violated the laws of physics in localized areas. But Marcus was ready for the chaos. His environmental monitoring systems had detected the building quantum instability, and he had positioned himself in one of the few areas where the effects would be minimal. While his opponents struggled with reality itself becoming unreliable, Marcus moved to eliminate the source of the problem. The Quantari had overextended itself badly, its normally subtle manipulations becoming crude and detectable as it fought to maintain control. Marcus could track its location by following the probability distortions, and those same distortions were interfering with the creature's ability to sense approaching threats. Marcus's attack was simple, direct, and utterly human in its execution. While the Quantari struggled with quantum calculations that were spiraling beyond its control, Marcus approached from downwind and shot with a crossbow he'd constructed from salvaged materials. The bolt wasn't designed to kill immediately. Instead, it carried a payload of synthetic pheromones that Marcus had created using chemical knowledge gained from studying the eliminated hunters. The pheromones were designed to trigger specific behavioral responses in creatures that relied on probability manipulation for survival. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The Quantari's probability-based defenses turned against it, causing every possible negative outcome to manifest simultaneously. A simple crossbow bolt became a cascade of worst-case scenarios that the creature's own abilities made inevitable. As the Quantari died, the probability distortions it had been generating collapsed, restoring normal quantum mechanics to the arena. But the damage was done. 2 more hunters had been eliminated, and the survivors were all operating at severely reduced efficiency. Marcus took a moment to appreciate the irony. The most sophisticated probability manipulator in galactic history had been killed by what was essentially a pointed stick fired by a primitive human. But the real victory wasn't in the elimination itself. It was in demonstrating something that most alien species never understood about human capabilities. Humans had never evolved specialized abilities because they had developed something far more dangerous: the capacity to analyze any system, identify its weaknesses, and develop tools to exploit those weaknesses. They didn't need built-in weapons because they could turn anything into a weapon. They didn't need natural armor because they could make their enemies destroy themselves. As the fourth day of competition ended, only 4 hunters remained active: Marcus, Winter's Embrace, Zephyra the Voltarian, the severely depleted Swarm Mind, and the increasingly unstable Nebular Collective. But Marcus was no longer hiding his capabilities. The arena's monitoring systems had finally begun to register patterns that couldn't be explained by coincidence or environmental hazards. Statistical analysis of hunter eliminations showed probability distributions that were so unlikely they could only result from deliberate manipulation. For the first time since the competition began, alien intelligence agencies were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about the human participant. Their analysis suggested that Marcus Chun wasn't just surviving. He was actively hunting other contestants with a level of strategic sophistication that challenged every assumption they had made about human capabilities. But by the time they began to understand what they were dealing with, it was too late. Marcus had spent 4 days studying his remaining opponents, learning their weaknesses, and positioning himself for the final phase of the competition. The hunt was entering its endgame, and the galaxy was about to discover why humans had never needed evolution to make them the most dangerous species in their ecosystem. They had something far more terrifying than claws or armor or energy manipulation abilities. They had intelligence, patience, and the absolute conviction that any problem could be solved if you understood it well enough, and were willing to work long enough to find the solution. The Galactic Hunt Championship was about to crown its most unlikely champion, and in doing so, teach the galaxy a lesson it would never forget. Never underestimate a species that has spent 200,000 years proving that the deadliest predator in any environment is the one smart enough to make that environment kill its enemies for it. The apex hunter wasn't the biggest or strongest or most naturally armed. It was the one that could think 3 moves ahead and had the patience to wait for the perfect moment to strike. And Marcus Chun was about to prove that humans had always been the ultimate apex predators. They just hadn't had the opportunity to demonstrate it on a galactic stage until now. The final environmental transition was unlike anything that had come before. The volcanic landscape didn't simply disappear. It was consumed by something that made reality itself seem unstable. The arena had become a composite environment, featuring fragments of all previous stages existing simultaneously in defiance of physics. Sections of Arctic ice bordered pools of lava, while temperate forests grew from crystalline formations that shouldn't have been able to support life. Marcus recognized the design immediately. A psychological warfare environment intended to disorient the surviving hunters by forcing them to constantly adapt to changing rules. But what the arena designers hadn't anticipated was a participant who had spent 5 days learning to manipulate environmental systems rather than simply survive them. His hidden network of environmental controls had grown throughout the competition, expanding from simple monitoring devices to a sophisticated command system that gave him unprecedented access to the arena's infrastructure. As the final stage began, Marcus wasn't just another hunter struggling to adapt. He had become the environment. The remaining contestants were struggling with more than just the chaotic landscape. 4 days of constant stress, elimination pressure, and resource depletion had pushed them all beyond their optimal performance parameters. But Marcus had been planning for exactly this scenario from the beginning. Winter's Embrace was trapped in a section where volcanic heat meets Arctic cold, created violent steam explosions every few minutes. Her ice manipulation abilities were being constantly countered by geothermal activity, forcing her to expend enormous energy just to maintain basic survival. But more critically, the thermal stress was affecting her cognitive functions, making her increasingly desperate and predictable. The Voltarian Zephyra had crystallized into her maximum defense form, but the energy requirements were unsustainable. She was effectively a living statue, nearly invincible but completely immobile. Marcus's analysis indicated she had perhaps 6 hours of energy reserves remaining before she would be forced to revert to a more vulnerable state. The Swarm Mind Collective was down to fewer than 50 functional drones, each one struggling with environmental conditions that changed faster than their adaptive algorithms could compensate. But the collective intelligence was still formidable, and Marcus knew it would be his most dangerous opponent in any direct confrontation. The Nebular Collective's representative had begun to show signs of consciousness fragmentation as the chaotic atmospheric conditions disrupted its gaseous nervous system. Parts of its awareness were becoming isolated from the central consciousness, creating opportunities that hadn't existed in the previous stages. Marcus began the endgame with characteristic patience. While his opponents struggled with immediate survival needs, he implemented what military strategists would recognize as a classic divide-and-conquer campaign. His first target was the fragmenting nebular entity. Using atmospheric manipulation techniques he'd perfected during the volcanic stage, Marcus began creating localized pressure differentials that would separate the creature's gaseous components without triggering defensive responses. To the entity, it would feel like natural atmospheric currents rather than deliberate attack. The process took 3 hours of careful work, but eventually Marcus had isolated nearly 30% of the Nebular Collective's consciousness in atmospheric pockets that he could control independently. These isolated fragments retained some intelligence, but lacked connection to the main entity's strategic thinking capabilities. Then, Marcus did something that demonstrated the terrifying creativity of human tactical thinking. He began using the isolated consciousness fragments as weapons against their parent entity. By manipulating atmospheric currents, Marcus could move the isolated fragments into positions where they would trigger the main entity's defensive responses against what appeared to be enemy attacks. The Nebular Collective found itself literally fighting pieces of its own consciousness, expending energy and attention on threats that were actually parts of itself. The psychological effect was devastating. The creature's remaining coherent consciousness began to fragment further as it struggled to understand how it could be simultaneously attacking and defending against itself. Within an hour, the once formidable hunter had dissolved into dozens of small, confused gas clouds that posed no threat to anyone. But Marcus's manipulations of atmospheric conditions had a secondary effect that he had carefully planned for. The pressure changes and electromagnetic disturbances were interfering with the Swarm Mind's quantum communication protocols, forcing the collective to cluster its remaining drones closer together to maintain coordination. This gave Marcus the opening he needed for his next elimination. The concentrated Swarm Mind presented a target that would have been impossible to attack with conventional weapons. 50 highly intelligent, adaptive drones working in perfect coordination could counter any direct assault. But Marcus had learned something about artificial intelligence that most species never discovered. The more sophisticated an AI system became, the more vulnerable it was to certain kinds of logical paradoxes. Using his environmental control network, Marcus began broadcasting a specific pattern of electromagnetic signals that carried what appeared to be valid tactical data. But embedded within the data stream was something that human computer scientists had discovered decades earlier, a cognitive trap designed to exploit flaws in recursive analysis algorithms. The Swarm Mind's collective intelligence was sophisticated enough to detect that the data contained some kind of logical inconsistency, but advanced enough to believe it could resolve the paradox through deeper analysis. The collective began devoting increasing computational resources to analyzing the paradox, creating a feedback loop that consumed more and more of its processing capacity. Within an hour, the Swarm Mind had effectively paralyzed itself through recursive analysis of an unsolvable logical problem. The drones remained functional, but the collective intelligence that coordinated them had trapped itself in an infinite loop of logical analysis. Marcus eliminated the helpless drones methodically, using simple kinetic weapons against targets that no longer possessed the coordination necessary to mount effective defenses. The most sophisticated artificial intelligence in the competition had been defeated by what was essentially a logical riddle. But even as Marcus eliminated his 7th and 8th opponents, he was aware that the galaxy was finally beginning to understand what they were dealing with. The arena's monitoring systems were tracking elimination patterns that could no longer be explained by coincidence, and alien intelligence agencies were conducting emergency analysis of human capabilities. It was too late to stop Marcus, but not too late for them to learn some uncomfortable truths about the species they had dismissed as weak and irrelevant. As the 5th day began, only 3 hunters remained: Marcus, Winter's Embrace, and the crystallized Voltarian. But the nature of the competition had fundamentally changed. This was no longer a contest between different species' natural abilities. It had become a demonstration of strategic intelligence versus raw power. Winter's Embrace had finally realized that the environmental chaos wasn't random. Her enhanced pattern recognition abilities had detected the subtle signs of deliberate manipulation, and she had concluded that one of the remaining hunters possessed technology far beyond anything they had been allowed to bring into the arena. But she had reached the wrong conclusion. Instead of suspecting the apparently primitive human, she had decided that the Voltarian must be using some kind of advanced crystalline technology to control environmental systems. Her attacks on Zephyra became increasingly desperate as she tried to eliminate what she believed was her most dangerous opponent. The irony was perfect. The most environmentally adapted hunter in the competition was destroying herself, trying to eliminate a target that posed no real threat, while completely ignoring the actual source of the environmental manipulation. Marcus used Winter's Embrace's misdirected aggression to implement his final gambit. Using atmospheric controls he developed during the previous stages, Marcus began creating temperature gradients that would amplify the glacian's ice manipulation abilities while simultaneously making them increasingly unstable. The process was delicate, requiring precise timing and careful manipulation of multiple environmental factors. But eventually, Marcus had created the conditions he needed, a feedback loop that would cause Winter's Embrace's own abilities to spiral beyond her control. The glacian's final assault on the Voltarian began with temperatures dropping to levels that approached absolute zero. Ice formations erupted from the ground with explosive force, creating a winter storm of unprecedented intensity. But the environmental conditions Marcus had established made the ice formations unstable, causing them to shatter and reform in increasingly chaotic patterns. Winter's Embrace found herself trapped in a storm of her own creation, unable to stop the cascade of ice manipulation that was spiraling beyond her control. The feedback loop Marcus had initiated turned her greatest strength into a fatal weakness as her own abilities began consuming the thermal energy from her body faster than she could regenerate it. The glacian's elimination was spectacular, a final display of power that lit up the arena with aurora effects and ice sculptures that would have been beautiful if they hadn't been marking the death of one of the galaxy's most formidable predators. And then there were two. Zephyra emerged from her defensive crystallization as the environmental chaos subsided. The Voltarian had survived by becoming essentially invulnerable, but the energy cost had been enormous. She was operating at minimum power levels, barely able to maintain consciousness, much less mount any kind of offensive action. She faced Marcus across a section of arena that had stabilized into something resembling a natural amphitheater, with scattered elements from all the previous environmental stages creating a landscape that seemed designed for a final confrontation. For the first time in the competition, Marcus stepped into full view of his opponent. Zephyra's crystalline form shifted as she analyzed this final adversary. Her species had detailed intelligence files on every participant, and none of the data had suggested that the human possessed any significant threat capability. Yet statistical analysis of the elimination patterns made it clear that Marcus Chun had been responsible for every hunter death, that hadn't resulted from direct combat. "Ow," she asked, her voice carrying harmonic frequencies that resonated through her crystalline structure. Marcus smiled, checking his equipment one final time. "You made the same mistake everyone makes about humans. You assume that because we don't have claws or armor or energy manipulation abilities, we must be weak. But you never asked the really important question." "What question?" "If humans are so weak and pathetic, how do we become the dominant species on a planet where everything was trying to kill us?" Zephyr's analysis algorithms worked frantically to process this information, but it was too late for tactical adjustments. Marcus had spent 5 days studying her capabilities, learning her weaknesses, and preparing for exactly this confrontation. The final battle was unlike anything the galaxy had expected. There were no energy beams, no displays of overwhelming physical power, no exotic abilities that defied physics. Instead, Marcus employed weapons that most alien species had never encountered: tools. A simple projectile weapon that used kinetic energy rather than exotic physics. Explosive charges that relied on chemical reactions rather than energy manipulation. Most devastating of all, environmental traps that turned the arena itself against his opponent. Zephyr's crystalline form was nearly invulnerable to energy attacks and could withstand enormous physical stresses. But Marcus had identified something that her species had never encountered on their homeworld: resonance frequencies. Using sonic generators constructed from salvaged equipment, Marcus began broadcasting specific sound patterns that created harmonic vibrations within Zephyr's crystalline structure. The technique was based on human understanding of material science, a field that most alien species had never needed to develop because they relied on biological adaptation rather than tool use. The harmonic attack was slow, but inexorable. Microscopic fractures began forming within Zephyr's crystalline matrix, spreading along structural fault lines that she couldn't detect until they reached critical mass. Her nearly invulnerable form became a liability as the resonance patterns trapped her in a body that was literally tearing itself apart from within. The end came swiftly. Zephyr's crystalline structure reached harmonic resonance cascade, and she shattered like glass in a spectacular display of refracting light that momentarily turned the arena into a rainbow prism. And then Marcus Chun stood alone in the center of the arena, the last hunter standing in a competition that had begun with 10 of the galaxy's most dangerous predators. The silence stretched for long moments as billions of viewers across 7-star systems tried to process what they had just witnessed. The weakest participant, the one with the longest odds in the history of the competition, had systematically eliminated every other hunter without engaging in a single direct combat exchange. The announcer's voice, when it finally came, carried a note of bewilderment that echoed across the galaxy. "Ladies, gentlemen, and distinguished beings of all classifications, we have our champion." But Marcus wasn't finished. As the arena's teleportation systems prepared to extract him, he activated one final device he'd constructed during the competition. Across the arena, holographic displays lit up showing detailed technical specifications for every trap, every environmental manipulation, every strategic gambit he had employed during the hunt. It was a comprehensive tutorial on human hunting techniques, delivered to a galactic audience that had never imagined such methods were possible. More than a victory, it was a declaration. Humanity wasn't just another species struggling to survive in a dangerous galaxy. They were the apex predators, and they had tools, techniques, and strategic thinking capabilities that could turn any environment into a hunting ground. As Marcus was teleported away to receive his victory honors, one final message appeared on every screen in the arena. "Earth sends its regards. We're looking forward to our new seat on the Galactic Council." The galaxy had gotten exactly what it asked for when it demanded that every species send their best hunter to compete. They just hadn't expected that humanity's best hunter would be someone who understood that the deadliest weapon in any environment was intelligence, patience, and the ability to turn any disadvantage into a strategic advantage. Marcus Chun had one more than a competition. He had announced humanity's arrival on the galactic stage, and he had done it in a way that would make sure no one ever underestimated humans again. The hunt was over, but in many ways, it was just the beginning. Earth now had a voice in galactic affairs, and that voice belonged to a species that had spent 200,000 years proving that they could overcome any challenge if they understood it well enough and had enough time to prepare. The galaxy was about to learn what it meant to share space with a species of apex predators who considered intelligence their primary weapon and viewed every problem as a puzzle waiting to be solved. They had written off humanity as weak and irrelevant. Marcus Chun had just taught them why that had been the greatest mistake in galactic history.